The Weight of Rust, a story of betrayal, fire, and the men we become. You built this life with your hands. She burned it down with a smile. Now watch what those hands build next. Part 1. The Crack in the Foundation. I always said the ocean doesn't lie. You can read it like a man who spent his whole life working near it. The color of the water in the morning, the way the wind shifts off the headland before a storm. The particular silence that settles over the harbor, an hour before the tide turns. These things tell you what's coming. I learned to read them at 14, standing on the dock beside my father. And I never forgot, but a woman. The woman you married. The woman whose name you carry tattooed on your left forearm. The woman who watched you carry your father's coffin and held your hand on the drive home and said nothing. Because she knew silence was the only language that fit a woman like that. You can read all your life and still miss the tide turning. My name is Caleb Marsh. I'm 47 years old. I own and operate Marsh Marine and Fabrication on the waterfront of Crestport, a working harbor town on the Oregon coast, where the fog rolls in every morning like a slow apology, and the fishing boats go out before dawn, and the smell of salt and diesel and cut steel is as constant as breathing. I've been in this building for 23 years, started with a welding torch, a borrowed forklift, and a lease I could barely afford. I built it into the largest marine fabrication shop on this stretch of coast. 31 employees. A reputation that brought work from as far north as Washington and as far south as the Bay Area. I also, until 11 months ago, had a wife. Her name was Nora. Nora Elliott Marsh. Though she'd started using Elliott professionally again sometime in the last 3 years, which I'd noticed and said nothing about, because that's what I did. I noticed things and said nothing, and went back to the shop and bent steel and told myself the distance between us was temporary. The ordinary friction of two busy people building separate things under the same roof. The night I found out I'd come home from a welding job on a research vessel docked at the North Pier, a job that was supposed to run until midnight, but finished early because the foreman had a family emergency. My truck came over the hill at 9:45, and I could see the house from the road the way I always could. The lit windows warm against the black tree line. Our house was a converted Victorian on Cliffside Road that Nora had spent 4 years restoring. Every room repainted, every floor refinished, every window replaced with period-appropriate glass. She'd done most of it herself on weekends, which I'd always loved about her. That quality of quiet, relentless competence. The living room light was on. So was the bedroom. So was a car in the driveway. I didn't recognize a black Audi Clean Current. You're the kind of car a person drives when they want to project a specific image. It had a parking permit for Crestport Harborside Business Center hanging from the rearview mirror. I sat at the bottom of the driveway for 3 minutes. Then I backed out onto the road and drove to the harbor and sat in my truck watching the lights on the water for 45 minutes, running down every explanation that wasn't the obvious one. And when I'd exhausted all of them, I drove home, parked in the street, walked in through the side door, and stood in my own kitchen, listening to the sound of my wife's laughter drifting down from the second floor. It wasn't nervous laughter. It wasn't polite laughter. It was the kind of laughter you only produce when you feel entirely safe. Unguarded, natural. The laughter of a person who has forgotten, at least for this moment, that the rest of the world exists. I hadn't heard her laugh like that in 2 years. I went back to the kitchen. I made coffee. I sat at the table where we'd eaten 10,000 breakfasts, and I waited. And after 20 minutes, I heard the front door close and the Audi start in the driveway and pull away, and then footsteps on the stairs. And then Nora stopped in the kitchen doorway wearing her bathrobe, and the expression of someone who has just walked into a room they were certain would be empty. "You're home early," she said. "Job finished early," I said. "Who was that?" The pause was a fraction of a second too long. Marcus, from the development office. We were going over the zoning appeal for the Harborside expansion. At 9:45 at night, we lost track of time. I looked at her. She looked at me. I'd been with this woman for 26 years, married for 22, and I knew every version of her face the way I knew the machinery in my shop. I knew which look meant she was tired, and which meant she was worried, and which meant she was calculating. This look was calculating. "Okay," I said. "There's coffee if you want it." She said she was tired and went back upstairs. I sat at the table until 2 in the morning. Then I went to bed. I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark beside my wife, and I breathed steadily, and I thought about the Audi in the driveway and the laughter I hadn't been able to produce in her for 2 years. And I made a decision that I didn't fully understand yet. I decided to know before I did anything else. Marcus Elliott. I found the name in an hour of phone records. I pulled the following morning after Nora left for her office at the county planning department, where she'd worked as a senior development planner for 11 years. Marcus Elliott. Not a coincidence with her maiden name, her younger brother 10 years her junior. I'd met him twice in 22 years. At our wedding, where he'd been 19, and already had the look of someone who thought the world owed him a cleaner version of itself. And at her mother's funeral, 8 years ago, where he'd shown up late and left early, and managed to make even grief feel like an imposition on his schedule. Nora rarely talked about him. When she did, it was with the controlled care of someone navigating a subject they've decided is mostly off limits. "Marcus is complicated," she'd said once years ago, and I'd let it go because the marriages I'd seen in Crestport, working people's marriages, harbor town marriages, had always had their territories of silence. The rooms you didn't open, because you'd both agreed they weren't worth the cost. But Marcus Elliott was the parking permit at the Harborside Business Center. I pulled the business registry. Elliott Meridian Developments, registered 14 months ago. Primary contact, Marcus James Elliott. Address 4, Harborside Business Center, Crestport. 14 months ago, Marcus had moved to Crestport. 14 months ago, the distance between me and Nora had gone from something I could attribute to the ordinary drift of long marriages to something I could feel in my chest when I woke up at 3 in the morning and reached across the bed and found she'd moved to the far edge in her sleep. 14 months and she'd never mentioned he was here. I closed the laptop. I went to my shop. I picked up a cutting torch and I cut through 12 inches of steel plate with the kind of focus that only comes when everything else has narrowed to a single point. Pete Wharton, my shop foreman, 20 years with me, the kind of man you build a business on, watched from across the floor for 10 minutes and then came over and turned off the torch himself. "You're going to cut right through that barge," he said. "I know." He waited. "I think Nora's having an affair." Pete didn't say anything for a moment. Then he pulled up a stool and sat down. "Tell me what you know," I told him. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, the way men who've worked with their hands for 30 years listen because they know the difference between a problem that needs talking through and a problem that needs solving. And they wait to find out which one it is before opening their mouth. "What do you want to do?" he said when I finished. "I want to know for certain. And then I want to make decisions with my eyes open." "Who's your lawyer?" "Don't have one." "You need one before you do anything else." He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a number. "Donna Reyes. She handled my divorce. Best family law attorney between here and Portland." I saved the number. I went back to work. That night I drove past the Harborside Business Center at 7:30 and saw the black Audi in the parking structure and the light on in a second-floor office and 2 silhouettes behind the frosted glass. The next morning, I called Donna Reyes. Part 2, the reckoning season. Donna Reyes was 53, compact and precise, with the kind of eyes that registered everything without advertising it. Her office was on the second floor of a building on Harbor Street, above a tackle shop, which I'd always thought was appropriate. She dealt in the same patient, methodical work as fishing. The long line and the waiting, and the knowledge that what you were after would eventually surface. "Walk me through your marriage," she said. From the beginning. It took an hour. She took notes without expression, occasionally asking a clarifying question. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked at me steadily. "Before we discuss legal strategy, I want to ask you one question. Is there any version of this that ends with you and your wife still married?" I thought about it seriously. I owed her that. 22 years of marriage deserves serious thought, even at the moment of its ending. "I don't know yet," I said finally. "That depends on things I don't know yet." "What things? Whether this is something that happened to us or something she chose entirely." Donna was quiet for a moment. "In my experience, it's usually both. But you're right that the proportion matters." She picked up her pen again. "Here's what I'd recommend. Don't confront her yet. Don't change your behavior. Don't move money. Don't access joint accounts beyond your normal pattern, and don't do anything that signals you know. We're going to spend the next 2 weeks building a factual picture." "I don't want to hire someone to follow my wife. I understand that. But you need documentation. What you do have is your own observation, your own memory, your own access to shared spaces. Keep a log. Dates times anything you notice that's inconsistent with the life you thought you were living." She held my gaze. "And Caleb, there's one more thing you need to know. Marcus Elliott's development company filed for a variance on the Harborside expansion project 6 months ago. The decision on that variance goes through the Crestport Planning Department." The silence that followed was one of the longest of my life. "Nora's office," I said. "Nora's office." For 2 weeks I watched. I watched with the same attention I brought to a complex fabrication job, methodically without rushing, checking each reading against the previous one. I documented what I saw. The late evenings at the office, 3 or 4 per week, where there had been one or none before Marcus arrived. The phone that got locked now when it had never been locked before. The Tuesday nights she described as a professional development seminar that ran from 6 to 9, which I confirmed through a simple search was a real seminar, one that met every other Tuesday, not every week. The evenings when I could see from her face that she'd been somewhere that made her feel the way she'd felt the night of the Audi. I also documented something else, something I hadn't expected: money. I hadn't looked closely at our joint accounts in 2 years. I managed the business finances, and Nora handled the household accounts by mutual agreement that had calcified over time into habit. When I looked now, I found 18 months of small withdrawals from the household savings amounts, between $400 and $1,200, all in cash, all on days that corresponded to the evenings she was late. The total was just under $22,000. I sat with that number for a long time. $22,000, paid for in the savings we'd built together dollar by dollar over 2 decades of running a small business in a harbor town where the work was seasonal and the margins were thin, and every slow winter meant we were spending what we'd saved in the summer. $22,000 of the money I'd bent steel and burned fingers, and breathed welding smoke for quietly moved into the life she was building somewhere else. I called Donna and told her, "That's a significant development," she said. "I want you to photograph every statement going back 18 months today, before anything changes." I did. Then I drove to the harbor and stood at the end of Pier 7, the pier my father had worked, where I'd learned to read the water, and I let myself feel the full weight of it. All of it at once without managing it, or distributing it, or setting any of it aside for later. The affair, the money, the variance, the 14 months of proximity she'd never mentioned. The laughter I'd heard from downstairs, I felt it all, and then I let the tide take it, and then I went back to work. The confrontation came on a Thursday, not because I'd planned it for Thursday. I'd planned it for the following week after Donna had finished her preliminary review of our financial exposure. But Nora came home that Thursday evening and set her bag on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of wine and said without turning around, "I want to talk about us." I set down the book I'd been reading. "Okay." She turned and looked at me with an expression I recognized, the one she wore when she'd rehearsed something and was trusting the rehearsal. "I think we need to acknowledge that this marriage has been struggling for a long time. I think we've both been unhappy, and I think we've both been avoiding saying so." "Okay," I said again. "I want a separation. I think some time apart would help us both figure out what we actually want." I looked at her. She was 44, still beautiful in the particular way that certain women get more beautiful as they move through their 40s. Something settling and clarifying about the face, the softening of things that had been sharp, and the sharpening of things that had been soft. I'd loved this face for 26 years. I'd kissed it good morning more mornings than I could count. "Is Marcus in Crestport?" I said. She went still. "Because his Audi was in our driveway 3 weeks ago at 9:45 at night, and because his development company has a variance pending in your office, and because $22,000 has left our savings account in 18 months, mostly on the evenings you were working late." I kept my voice even. "I want to know how long." The rehearsal dissolved. Something underneath it surfaced, something complicated, not just guilt, but something older and more tangled, like a rope that had been coiled the wrong way for years. She sat down at the kitchen table. 14 months, since he came to Crestport. Before that, before he moved here. She wrapped both hands around her wine glass. There was something before, when we were young, before you and I, and then he came back and it." She stopped. It picked up. "It was never what I wanted it to be. I know that's not. I know that doesn't make it better. Did you influence the variance decision?" The pause was 1 second. 1 second too long. I recused myself from the final vote. "But not from the process." She didn't answer. "Nora, did you use your position to benefit his application?" "I didn't. It wasn't." She set down the wine glass. "I provided information that was relevant to the environmental impact assessment. Information that I would have provided to any applicant. But you provided it specifically to him." She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not guilt exactly. Something more like the face of a person who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a long time and has finally set it down and is not sure how they feel about the relief of it. "I'm sorry," she said. And the simplicity of it, the inadequacy of it, made something cold settle in my chest and stay there. "I want you out of this house tonight," I said. "You can take what you need for a week. My lawyer will contact yours." She started to say something. Then she stopped. Then she stood up, and I watched her move through the kitchen that she'd spent 2 years restoring, the tile she'd chosen, the fixtures she'd hunted through salvage yards for the window above the sink that looked out onto the garden she'd planted, and walk upstairs to pack a bag. I sat at the table and listened to the sound of her moving through the rooms above me. And when the front door closed, I was still sitting there, and the house was very quiet, and the ocean was audible from the open window. And I thought, now the real work begins. Part 3. Fire and what it leaves. 3 days after Nora left, her mother called. Eleanor Elliott was 71 and had lived in Crestport for 40 years. She'd moved here when her first husband, Nora's father, had taken a job at the paper mill that no longer existed. After he died, she'd stayed. She was a woman who stayed. She ran the library's literacy program, tended a garden that the whole neighborhood knew by sight, and had always, in 22 years of knowing her, treated me with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who had decided I was worth keeping. "Caleb," she said, "I need to see you." We met at her house, a small Cape Cod. 3 blocks from mine, the kind of house that smells like books, and something baking always regardless of the hour. She made tea and set it on the table between us, and looked at me with the clear eyes of someone who has survived significant loss and is no longer frightened by difficult things. She told me, Eleanor said, about Marcus, about what's happened. Okay, I want to tell you something about Marcus that Nora has never told you. She wrapped her hands around her mug. When Nora was 18 and Marcus was 8, their father, my first husband Robert, started having serious psychiatric episodes. He was diagnosed with bipolar disorder with psychotic features. It took 2 years to stabilize him, and during those 2 years, Nora was the adult in that house. She was 18 years old, and she was managing her brother's school schedule and her father's medications and her mother's collapse because I fell apart completely for almost a year. I'm not proud of that. I said nothing. Marcus was 8. He was terrified and confused, and the only stable person in his world was Nora. She sacrificed her first year of college. She stayed home. She held the family together. Eleanor set her mug down. And Marcus has never been able to let go of that. He has never been able to accept that she built a life that doesn't revolve around him. He has spent 20 years finding ways to pull her back. She's an adult, I said carefully. She made choices. She did. I'm not asking you to excuse those choices. I'm asking you to understand the ground they grew in. Eleanor looked at me steadily. Marcus manipulates her through her guilt. He always has. He calls it love. It isn't. I thought about that conversation for days afterward. I thought about the girl who'd been 18 and running a household and managing a psychiatric crisis while her friends were at freshman orientation. I thought about the woman I'd married, steady, quiet, competent with a territory of silence around her family that I'd always respected without fully understanding. I thought about what it means to be the person who holds everything together for long enough that you can't find yourself anymore under the weight of it. None of this excused what she'd done, but it changed the shape of the thing I was carrying. Meanwhile, I built. This is what I know how to do. When the world becomes unmanageable, I build. I take raw material, and I apply heat and pressure and precision, and I make something out of it that wasn't there before. It's not insight exactly. It's more like faith, the belief that if you work carefully and honestly and persistently, you will eventually have something solid in your hands. The week after Nora left, I finalized a contract I'd been in preliminary discussions about for 3 months, a contract with a wind energy company to fabricate specialized marine components for an offshore installation 40 miles up the coast. It was the largest contract in Marsh Marine's history, 27 units, 18-month timeline, a figure that would require me to expand my floor space and hire 12 additional welders. I called Pete into the office and showed him the numbers. He read them twice. Then he looked up. You sure about the timing? The timing is exactly right, I said. We need something to build. The financing's going to be complicated. I've already spoken to the bank. I bought this building outright 6 years ago. It's collateral. I looked at Pete. I need you on this. Fully on this. Can you do that? When have I ever not been? He folded the contract and handed it back. I'll start on the labor plan today. At the same time, I was meeting with Donna 3 times a week, building the legal architecture of what came next. The divorce petition was filed on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Nora's attorney, a man named Gerald Cross, who had a reputation for aggressive strategy, had responded with a petition that listed the house, the business equity, and our shared retirement accounts as marital assets subject to equitable distribution, my business. 23 years of building of risk, of the specific kind of sacrifice you make when you're a small business owner in a harbor town, the slow winters, the sleepless nights before payroll, the jobs you take at break even to keep your people working. He was listing Marsh Marine. Can he do that? I asked Donna. He can argue for it. Whether he succeeds is a different question. She was very calm in the way of a person who has seen this play before and knows exactly how to respond to each move. The business predates the marriage by 1 year. You have records going back to founding. We'll establish the premarital equity base and argue that growth attributable to your labor is not equally divisible. It's a strong position. She paused. There's something else. I need to ask you about the Harborside variance. What about it? If there's evidence that Nora used her county position to benefit Marcus's development application, that's relevant. It's potentially a conflict of interest violation, possibly an ethics complaint. If we can establish it, it significantly changes her leverage in this proceeding. I sat with that for a moment. I'm not interested in destroying her career. Donna looked at me steadily. Caleb, she may have committed an ethics violation in the course of an affair that also involved moving $22,000 of marital assets. You don't have to protect her from the consequences of her own actions. I know, I said. I'm not protecting her. I'm just telling you what I'm interested in. I looked at the papers on her desk. I want what's mine. I want to keep my shop. I want the house. I want an honest accounting of where the money went. I don't want to burn down what she spent 22 years building professionally. Donna made a note. Understood. Marcus Elliott came to see me 12 days after Nora moved out. I was on the shop floor doing an inspection on a finished hull section when Pete came to find me. There's a man in the office. Says he's Nora's brother. Wants to talk. I set down my clipboard. Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes. I took 10. I wanted him to wait. He was standing by the window when I walked in, looking out at the harbor with the proprietary expression of someone who has decided everything they survey is an opportunity. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered with Nora's dark eyes and none of her steadiness. The kind of man whose attractiveness is immediately visible and gradually less convincing the longer you look. Marcus, I said. I didn't offer my hand. Caleb. He turned from the window. I wanted to have a conversation man to man. Go ahead. He sat down without being invited. I know you're angry. I understand that. But I want you to understand that what's happened between Nora and me isn't something we planned. You moved to the town where she lives 14 months ago without mentioning it to her husband. You've been conducting an affair in our home. You've been running a development application through her office. I settled into my chair. That sounds planned to me. The variance was legitimate. Marcus, I don't want to hear your justifications. Tell me what you came here to say. He shifted. I came to ask you to let her go without a fight. I looked at him for a long moment. You came to ask me to let her go. A prolonged legal battle hurts everyone. It'll cost you money you'd rather put into this place. It'll damage her career. It won't change the outcome. And what is the outcome? He met my eyes. She wants to be with me. The room was very quiet. Outside, I could hear the harbor, the creak of boats against the dock, the distant cry of gulls, the sound of a ship's horn somewhere out on the water, the sounds I'd lived inside for 47 years. Let me tell you something about the outcome, I said. I kept my voice level and quiet. I'm going to walk out of this marriage with my pen as my house and an accurate accounting of every dollar that left our joint accounts. Whether your sister's career survives the ethics review is a matter of her choices, not mine. And as for you, I know what you are. I've talked to people in Portland who worked with Elliott Meridian before you moved here. I know about the project in Lake Oswego. I know about the investor dispute in Seattle. I stood up. The variance decision comes before the Planning Commission next month. I think the commission should probably know about the relationship between the applicant and the county planner who processed his environmental impact assessment. Marcus's expression changed. Under the confidence, something tight and watchful. That would hurt her, he said. Not me. Maybe. But it would be the truth. I walked to the office door and held it open. I think you should leave now. He stood slowly, and I could see him calculating, weighing what he had against what I had. the way men like him always do, with the kind of cold efficiency that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with advantage. Whatever he calculated, he walked out without another word. I watched the black Audi pull out of my parking lot and turn toward the harbor, and something in me settled, not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of clarity. I knew who I was dealing with. I knew what it would take. Now I knew the shape of the fight. Part 4. What families do. 2 weeks after Marcus left my office, a second car appeared in my life, a car I recognized. It belonged to Tom Vickers, Nora's closest colleague at the planning department. A man I'd eaten dinner with a dozen times, who'd come to our house for Christmas the previous year and sat at our table and laughed at my stories about difficult clients and told me he envied what Nora and I had built together. Solid was the word he'd used. You two are solid. I saw his car parked outside the Harborside Business Center on a Thursday evening when I was driving back from a material supplier. It was 9:15. The lights were on in Marcus's second-floor office. I drove past without stopping. I drove to Flanagan's, which is the bar where harbor people go when they need to sit with something they're not ready to talk about yet. And I ordered a beer and thought about what I knew and what I didn't know, and what difference it made. What I knew Tom Vickers was Nora's closest professional friend. He knew her cases, her calendar, her vulnerabilities. He was well-liked in the department, well-positioned politically, and had always had the quality of someone who collected useful information, the way other people collect furniture, casually, apparently without purpose. Until one day, you notice the room is very full. What I didn't know, whether Tom's presence in Marcus's office was professional or personal, and whether it was related to Nora or independent of her. What I suspected Tom Vickers had known about the affair before I did. He'd been in a position to know they shared an office suite, worked on overlapping projects, had the kind of professional proximity that makes it nearly impossible to be ignorant of a colleague's emotional state. And if he'd known, the question wasn't just what he'd done with the knowledge, but why he'd sat at my table at Christmas and told me we were solid. I called Pete the next morning. Not Donna, not yet. Pete first, because Pete knew people. Tom Vickers, I said. What do you know about him? Pete was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he knew more than he was deciding whether to say. Why? His car was at Harborside last night. How late? After 9. Another pause. About 8 months ago, there was a conversation at the Harbor Association meeting. Vickers was there. Some of the guys were talking about the Harborside application, specifically about whether it should have gotten as far as it did, given some questions about the environmental impact data. Pete chose his words carefully. There was some suggestion that the data had been selectively presented, not fabricated but curated. And Vickers was in that conversation. He was listening. He didn't say much. Pete paused again. Caleb, I don't know what that means for you, but it means he's been aware of something irregular for at least 8 months and hasn't said anything to anyone official, which means he has a reason not to. Or he's just covering for Nora because she's his colleague and he doesn't want to create problems. Or he has a more specific interest in the outcome of that variance. The silence between us had the weight of a thing neither of us wanted to name directly. I'll ask around, Pete said. He called back 48 hours later. Marcus Elliott's Harborside project has a secondary investor, Pete said. I got this from Dave Hart at the Harbor Commission. He found it in the filing documents last week. The investor is listed under an LLC. I had someone run the registered agent. He paused. It's a management company that has one client, T.A. Vickers. I sat in my office chair and looked at the harbor through my window. The water was gray-green and steady in the November morning, the color it turns when the weather is about to change. Tom Vickers is invested in the project that Nora's office was processing, 23% stake in the LLC structure, and he's been in regular contact with Marcus. Based on what I can piece together, yes. Pete's voice was careful. Caleb, this is bigger than a divorce proceeding. This is potentially a government corruption matter. If a county planner's closest colleague is financially invested in a project she was processing, and he knew about it and didn't disclose it. I know. I turned away from the window. I need to call Donna. Donna was quiet for a full 30 seconds after I finished. Does Nora know about Vickers' investment? She asked. I don't know. That question matters significantly. She was thinking aloud in the deliberate way she did when a case shifted under her. If she knew if Vickers disclosed his stake to her, and she processed the application anyway, the ethics violation is substantially more serious. If she didn't know, she's potentially also a victim of a scheme that used her relationship with Marcus as cover, which is worse for her. In terms of professional consequences, if she knew, it's potentially criminal. If she didn't know, it's still a serious violation, but it's also a betrayal by someone she trusted. A pause. In terms of your divorce proceeding, it changes your leverage considerably either way. But I want to be clear with you, Caleb. This is now potentially a matter for the district attorney's office, not just family court. How you proceed with this information is a decision you need to make carefully. I need to talk to Nora, I said. That's not what I'd recommend as your attorney. I know. I looked at the harbor through my window. But it's what I'm going to do. I drove to the apartment Jennifer Morrison had rented. The apartment I knew from Pete's research, 3 blocks from the county building, the second floor of a converted Victorian, not unlike the one Nora and I lived in, which struck me as a detail too painful to be ironic. Nora opened the door and looked at me with the expression she'd been wearing since the mediation, that clear-eyed, exhausted steadiness of someone who has stopped managing their reactions and is simply having them. Can I come in? She stepped back. The apartment was smaller than I'd expected, and more orderly. Nora's quality, the instinct toward arrangement. Books shelved, papers organized, a single plant on the windowsill that she'd obviously brought from the house, a small succulent I recognized from her kitchen counter. I told her about Tom Vickers. I told her about the LLC and the 23% stake, and the Harbor Association conversation, and Marcus's second-floor office at 9:15 on a Thursday. I watched her face as I talked. I watched the clear-eyed steadiness fracture and reassemble and fracture again, the way materials behave under stress holding, until they don't, and then the crack moving through faster than you can track it. When I finished, she sat down on the couch and put her face in her hands, and didn't say anything for a long time. I didn't know, she said finally. Her voice was muffled behind her hands. About Tom, I had no idea. Did Marcus know? She looked up. He had to. The LLC would have been part of the investment structure he built. He had to know who his investors were. Her eyes were red at the edges. He used me to access my professional position, knowing that my closest colleague was financially invested in the outcome. He arranged it so that I would be the point of exposure if anything went wrong, and Tom would remain invisible. She stopped. He let me think this was about us, about whatever it was between us, and the whole time it was just about the variance. You don't know that's all it was. Caleb, I'm not defending him. I'm saying you don't know the full truth of it yet. I looked at her steadily. But I need you to hear this clearly. The district attorney's office is going to get this information. Not from me, necessarily. This is already in public filings and a county commission process that has its own oversight. But it's going to surface. And when it does, the question of what you knew and when is going to matter enormously. She looked at me. What are you telling me to do? I'm telling you to talk to a lawyer tonight. Not Gerald Cross, someone who handles white-collar defense, not divorce. And I'm telling you, I paused. I'm telling you that whatever happened with Marcus, whatever your reasons were, you are not the same as him. You didn't arrange this. You were arranged around. Something moved across her face. Why are you telling me that? I thought about Eleanor's question. Do what's true, whatever that is. Because it's true, I said, and because I'm not finished with you. I stood up and walked to her door. Behind me, I could hear the sound of her breathing in the particular rhythm that meant she was working very hard not to cry in front of someone. I'd heard that rhythm 100 times over 22 years, and I knew it the way I knew the sound of the harbor, by its quality, by what it meant, by what it required. I stopped at the door. "Call a lawyer tonight, Nora. Tonight." Then I left. There is a particular kind of damage that happens inside families that looks from the outside like nothing at all. I learned this watching my father. He was a man who never raised his voice, never broke in house anything, never did any of the dramatic things that register as damage in other people's accounts. What he did was simpler and more total. He was absent. Not physically, he was there every morning at the kitchen table, and every evening in front of the television, and every Sunday at the church, where his family had sat in the same pew for 3 generations. But he was absent in the way that matters, the way that leaves children growing up inside a structure that looks like a family and functions like an empty room. My mother compensated by being present twice over. She was the heat source, the warmth, the attention, the voice that asked you how your day was and actually listened to the answer. When she died of a stroke at 58, the house went cold immediately, and my father lasted 14 months before following her, as if presence had been something she'd been providing for him too. And without it, there was no reason to keep the machinery running. I thought about this a lot in the months after Nora left. Not because it excused anything, but because it helped me understand something about what I'd been in my own marriage. I'd been my father. Present in body. Working, providing, maintaining. But absent in the way that matters. The way that leaves your wife growing up in a structure that looks like a marriage and functions like an empty room. I wasn't absolving Nora. What she'd done was real and had real consequences, and I was going to deal with those consequences with both eyes open. But I was done telling myself a story in which I was purely a victim. That version was too simple, and I'd always been bad at simple. The first time I saw Nora after she left, it was at a county zoning hearing I hadn't planned to attend. She was sitting at the applicant's table beside Marcus and their attorney. I was in the gallery because a decision on the Harborside variance would directly affect my shop's waterfront access, a detail neither of them had apparently considered when they'd assumed I'd stay away. I hadn't told Donna I was coming. I hadn't told Pete. I just sat in the 3rd row of the public gallery and watched my wife present technical data alongside the man she'd chosen over 22 years of marriage. And I noticed things. I noticed that she was precise and thorough and gave nothing away, the same qualities that had made her exceptional at her job for 11 years. I noticed that Marcus beside her leaned toward her when she spoke in a way that was slightly proprietary, the kind of body language that registers to anyone paying attention. I noticed that 2 of the commissioners were watching him rather than her presentation, with expressions that suggested they were doing their own calculating. I noticed most of all that Nora was unhappy, not performing unhappiness for my benefit. She didn't know I was there, just unhappy in the fundamental structural way that certain people carry when they've made a choice that was supposed to solve a problem and has instead created several new ones. I recognized it because I'd worn that expression myself in the last years of our marriage, and I'd never known what to call it until now. After the hearing, I was standing outside on the steps when she came through the door. She stopped when she saw me. "Caleb, Nora." We stood there for a moment on the courthouse steps, with the October wind coming in off the harbor and the gulls arguing somewhere above us. "You came," she said. Not accusatory, almost wondering. "The variance affects my waterfront access. I have standing as a neighboring property owner." "I know." She looked at me steadily. "How are you?" "Working," I said. "You?" Something moved across her face. "Working." Marcus appeared in this doorway behind her, saw me, and went still. I looked at him once briefly, the kind of look that required nothing further, and then I looked back at Nora. Tell Eleanor I'll call her this week, I said. She nodded. I walked down the steps to my truck. Eleanor called me the following Tuesday. She came to see me, Eleanor said. Last night. She stayed for 3 hours. A pause. Caleb, I think you should know she's not happy. I know that doesn't change anything for you right now, and I'm not asking it to. But she's not the person who knows what she wants and has gone to get it. She's someone who made a terrible mistake and is beginning to understand what she's lost. What does she say about Marcus? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She says she's trying to figure out where the obligation ends and the rest of it begins. She's always had trouble telling those apart when it comes to him. I thought about the girl who was 18, managing a household that had collapsed, holding her brother together through a crisis that should have been an adult's job. I thought about the ways that kind of responsibility accepted too young, carried too long, can become indistinguishable from love. Eleanor, I said, what do you want me to do? She was quiet for a long moment. I want you to do what's true, she said finally. Whatever that is. The ethics review came from the county administrator's office on a Thursday morning 3 weeks before the divorce was scheduled to go to mediation. An anonymous complaint had been filed regarding Nora's involvement in the Harborside variance process. I hadn't filed it. Donna had mentioned it to a professional contact at the county administrator's office, not as a complaint, but in the course of a routine conversation about conflict of interest standards. The contact had determined that a review was warranted and had initiated it independently. Nora called me that afternoon, the first time she'd called me directly since leaving the house. Did you do this? Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the cost of the control. No, I said, but I knew it might happen. That's the same thing. It isn't, but I understand why it feels that way. I paused. Nora, I told you weeks ago that I didn't want to destroy your career. That was true when I said it, and it's still true. The review could result in a suspension or termination. I know. And that would be the consequence of what you did, not what I... The silence lasted 10 seconds. I hate that you're right about that. I know. Caleb. Her voice changed. Something underneath the control came through. I'm so sorry. I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I need you to know that I am. I sat at my kitchen table, her table, the one she'd found at an estate sale and refinished over a long weekend. And I breathed for a moment. I know you are, I said. I'll talk to you at mediation. I hung up and sat in the silence of the house for a long time. Part 5. The Tide Comes Back. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday in November, 4 months after Nora had left the house. 4 months is long enough to know some things you didn't know before. Long enough for the acute pain to settle into something more chronic and less sharp. Long enough to learn which parts of yourself were dependent on the relationship and which were structural, which parts need the other person to function, and which were always yours. I'd spent those 4 months working mostly. The wind energy contract was in full production. The shop floor had 12 new faces, and the smell of steel and flux and burning filled every corner of the building from 6 in the morning until 9 at night. I ate most meals at my desk or standing at the fabrication table, and I slept well, which surprised me, because I'd always thought grief would be insomniac. Instead, it was just work. The grief was in the work, in the particularity of attention you bring to something when you're doing it, instead of feeling something else. I also spent time with Eleanor, who fed me dinner twice a week without comment, and talked about her garden and the literacy program and the birds she could see from her kitchen window. She never brought up Nora unless I did. She never offered unsolicited analysis. She just made food and let me be in a house that felt like a home. And that was I discovered exactly what I needed. I spent time with Pete, who had a gift for companionable silence that I have come to believe is rarer and more valuable than most of the things people celebrate. The morning of the mediation, I arrived at Donna's office at 8 to review the final position. She spread the summary across her desk and walked me through it with her usual precision. Marsh Marine, protected. We'd established the premarital equity base and documented 23 years of growth, attributable to my labor capital investment and business relationships. Gerald Cross had probed this aggressively in pre-mediation discovery and found it solid. He'd backed off. The house mine. I'd owned it before the marriage purchased with my father's life insurance money at 23 years old. The renovations Nora had completed were acknowledged and would be compensated. The joint savings subject to accounting. We'd traced the $22,000 the majority had gone to Marcus's business ventures in the form of undisclosed loans. Donna had characterized these as dissipation of marital assets. Gerald had not contested this vigorously, which told me Nora had made a decision about how hard to fight. The retirement account split fairly. "One more thing," Donna said. She looked at me with the careful expression she used when she was about to say something she'd been holding. "Gerald called me yesterday evening, off the record." She paused. "He said Nora wants to know if there's any scenario in which you'd be open to counseling before we finalize." I looked at her for a long time. "She's still with Marcus. He said that situation has recently changed." I looked at the papers on her desk. At 23 years of building documented in columns and figures, at the shape of a life I'd thought I understood. "Tell Gerald that Nora can ask me herself," I said, "if she wants to ask." She was waiting in the mediation room when I arrived, a conference room at a neutral office downtown. Winter light coming through long windows, the kind of functional space that accumulates the emotional residue of the decisions made in it and gives nothing back. Nora was alone. Gerald Cross was in the hallway, giving her a moment which told me something about how the morning had been arranged. I sat down across from her. She looked at me with the expression I'd been thinking about since the courthouse steps. That structural unhappiness. The face of someone who has been carrying something wrong for too long and is finally ready to set it down and examine what it is. "He's gone?" she said. "Marcus, I ended it 3 weeks ago." She looked at her hands. "I should have done it months ago. I should have done it before any of this. I knew what he was. I knew what he wanted. She stopped. "You couldn't separate the obligation from the rest," I said. She looked up. "My mother told you. Your mother helped me understand. I'm not using that as an excuse. What I did was a choice. Multiple choices over 14 months, each one I could have made differently." She was very clear-eyed and still. "I'm telling you Marcus is gone because you deserve to know the truth, not because I expect anything from it." "What do you expect?" "I expect that we sign these papers today and both of us try to rebuild something from what's left." She paused. "I was hoping, I don't know if hoping is the right word. I was wondering if there was any version of this in which we could be not what we were. Something else. Later. When there's enough distance." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had held her family together at 18 and never quite let go of that weight. The woman who had restored every room in my house with her hands. The woman whose laughter I'd heard from downstairs and hadn't been able to produce for 2 years. The woman who had made the worst choice I'd ever watched someone make, and was sitting across from me now with the clear eyes of someone who had stopped running. "I don't know," I said. "I honestly don't know what's on the other side of this." "Neither do I. But I'm not interested in being finished with you," I said. "I want you to know that. Whatever that means going forward, I'm not finished." She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something had shifted. "Okay," she said. "Okay." We signed the papers that day. Marsh Marine stayed mine. The house stayed mine. The assets were divided fairly, with Nora repaying the $22,000 over an agreed schedule. We were legally divorced on a rainy Thursday in December, 8 months after the night of the Audi in the driveway, and I marked the occasion by driving to Pier 7 and standing at the end of it in the rain for 20 minutes, looking at the water. The ethics review resulted in a formal censure and a 90-day suspension for Nora. She used the 90 days to take a leave from the county and consult on a non-profit housing project in Astoria, which she'd told me about in the brief, careful phone calls that had become our new mode of contact calls that lasted 15 or 20 minutes about specific things, with the tentative quality of two people learning a new language one word at a time. Marcus's variance was denied by the Planning Commission 4 votes to 1. Elliott Meridian. Developments filed for dissolution 6 weeks later. He moved to Portland, and as far as I know, is already locating the next opportunity. Part 6, Reconstruction. The Morrison Auto Center opening in the original story was a grand ceremony with ribbon cutting and speeches. Mine was quieter. On the 1st of March, I opened the new annex of Marsh Marine, 12,000 square feet of additional floor space, new welding stations, a precision CNC machine I'd been coveting for 8 years, and room for the workforce the wind energy contract required. Pete stood beside me as we walked through it. Before the crew arrived, just the two of us in the clean, empty space, our footsteps echoing. "Your father would have had something to say about this," Pete said. "He'd have said I was showing off." Pete smiled. He'd have been proud. I stood in the middle of my shop. My expanded shop, built on the foundation I'd laid 23 years ago with a borrowed forklift and a lease I could barely afford. And I felt something I can only describe as recognition. Not pride, exactly. More like the feeling of having arrived at a place you knew was coming, but couldn't be certain you'd reach. At noon, the crew came in. 31 original employees, 12 new ones. Pete gave a brief speech that was entirely practical and entirely right. We cut the ceremonial first component of the wind energy contract on the new machine, and someone had brought a cake, which is not the kind of thing I would ever have organized, but which turned out to be exactly correct. I stood in my shop and ate cake with my people, and felt that the ground beneath my feet was solid. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Nora came back to Crestport. She had been offered a position with the county in an advisory capacity, a restructured role that acknowledged the suspension, while also acknowledging 11 years of expertise they couldn't easily replace. She took it. She moved into an apartment on Harbor Street 3 blocks from the waterfront, with a view of the boats that she'd told me she found unexpectedly comforting. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Nora came back to Crestport. She had been offered a position with the county in an advisory capacity, a restructured role that acknowledged the suspension, while also acknowledging 11 years of expertise they couldn't easily replace. She took it. She moved into an apartment on Harbor Street 3 blocks from the waterfront, with a view of the boats that she'd told me she found unexpectedly comforting. The Tom Vickers matter had been referred to the district attorney's office and was under investigation. Vickers had resigned from the county 4 days after the referral, which told its own story. Marcus's variance denial had triggered a demand letter from the LLC investors, including now publicly. Vickers and the whole structure of Elliott Meridian Developments was unwinding through creditor proceedings. Marcus had retained an attorney in Portland and was, as far as I knew, not speaking to his sister. Nora had received a formal reprimand and a 90-day suspension. Not termination. A finding that reflected the county's determination that she had not known about Vickers's investment and had not deliberately manipulated the variance outcome for personal financial gain. She had the finding noted engaged in conduct that created a serious conflict of interest. She accepted the reprimand without appeal. Her attorney, the white-collar defense lawyer she'd retained the night I visited her apartment, had described the outcome as the best available result, given the facts. Nora had described it as what she deserved, which was, I'd come to understand, her way of processing things. Clear-eyed acknowledgement without self-destruction. We started having dinner once a week. Not because we'd planned to. It began when I ran into her at the fish market on a Wednesday evening, and we ended up eating at the counter together for 2 hours, talking about her work and the wind contract, and Eleanor's garden, and all the ordinary things that accumulate over 2 decades of shared life and don't stop being shared just because the legal structure around them has changed. Those early dinners were careful things. We were careful with each other, the way you're careful with a material you've worked with for 20 years and know the yield strength of. You apply force slowly, measuring the response, staying well inside the limits. We talked about work and weather and Eleanor. We didn't talk about Marcus or the variance or the $22,000. We didn't talk about the night of the Audi or the laughter I'd heard from the bottom of the stairs. We talked around those things. The way you talk around a weld you're not sure about yet, giving it time to cool, waiting until you can test it properly before trusting it. But there were moments when the talking around fell away. The 4th Wednesday. We were walking back from the fish market along the harbor when she stopped and stood at the railing above the water, looking out at the lights on the mooring field. I stood beside her. The wind was coming off the headland with the particular cold clarity of November on the Oregon coast. "Do you ever think about who we were when we met?" she asked. "Sometimes. I was 22. You were 21. You already had the lease on the shop barely, but you had it. I remember thinking this man is going to build something." She looked at the water. "I was right about that. You were a good partner," I said, "for most of it, and then I wasn't." "No," I said, "and then you weren't." She turned to look at me, and in the harbor light, her face had the quality I'd always loved most about it, that absolute refusal to pretend. "I spent most of our marriage being proud of what you built, and not knowing how to say so, not saying it out loud. I told myself you knew. I told myself a lot of things I should have said instead. I should have asked," I said. "I should have asked you more things. I got so good at not needing answers that I stopped noticing you had things to say." We stood there in the cold for a moment longer. "I don't know what this is," she said finally. "What we're doing, I don't have a word for it." "Neither do I said, "but I think we're building it." She looked at me and something in her face shifted, not the old calculating expression, not the rehearsed steadiness, but something simpler and more honest than either. "Okay," she said. "Okay, let's build it." We walked back along the harbor in the dark, not touching, not rushing. 2 people moving at the pace of something that was going to take as long as it took and would be what it was when it arrived. That is, I've come to believe the only honest way to build anything. You don't rush the weld. You don't apply too much heat too fast. You work at the pace the material requires, and you test it when it's ready, and you trust the result, because you earned it through patience and honesty, and the kind of care that doesn't ask for recognition, because the work itself is the point. Whatever Nora and I were becoming, I didn't have a name for it yet. But I had a harbor full of lights, and a shop full of people, and the sound of the water that my father had taught me to read. And I had enough patience left to wait for the tide to show me what it carried. It wasn't a romance. It wasn't a reconciliation in any formal sense. It was 2 people who had been through something significant together, who had broken something that could not be fully repaired, who were discovering what could be built from the remaining material. There were hard conversations. There were evenings when the weight of everything that had happened was in the showroom with us, like a third person. There were nights when I drove home from her apartment and sat in my truck and wondered whether what I was doing was foolish or whether it was simply honest, whether the distinction even mattered. I kept coming back to what Donna had said in our first meeting. "Is there any version of this that ends with you and your wife still married?" I'd said I didn't know. At the time, it was the truest thing I could offer. What I'd learned since was that the question itself was the wrong one. It asked me to choose between 2 versions of a future I couldn't see yet, when what I actually had was the present, the Wednesday evenings, and the careful phone calls, and the long dinners, and the slow, tentative work of two people who had broken something and were deciding together whether to leave it broken or try to make something different from the pieces. I chose the work. It's the only thing I know how to choose. A year after the night of the Audi, I was on Pier 7 at dawn. The same pier, the same water, the same light, breaking over the headland, the way it breaks on October mornings, on the Oregon coast, oblique and clear and patient. I'd been out since 5, walking the way I walked when I needed to think without thinking, just moving through the salt air, letting the harbor do what the harbor does, which is organize everything into its proper perspective. My phone buzzed. A text from Nora. "Still on for dinner tonight." I typed back yes. 7. Then I stood at the end of the pier and looked at the water. The ocean doesn't lie. The color of it in the morning, the way the wind shifts off the headland, the silence before the tide turns, these things are true, and they tell you what's coming. Not everything, not the whole story, but enough to work with. I'd spent 26 years with a woman I'd loved and failed and been failed by and was still somehow not finished with. I'd spent 23 years building a business in a harbor town where the work was hard and the seasons were real and the margins of success were thin enough to require constant attention. I'd lost things I'd thought were permanent and found things I hadn't known I needed and stood in the rain on a pier at dawn more times than I could count. The life I had now was not the life I'd planned. It was smaller in some ways and larger in others, and its edges were rougher and its foundations were more honestly tested. And it was mine in a way that nothing simply given to you can ever be. My truck was parked at the top of the dock. Across the water, the first lights were coming on in the harbor. The wind energy installation was visible on the horizon 40 miles north, a cluster of turbines I'd helped to build turning in the morning wind, with the particular patience of things that are designed to convert force into something useful. I went back to work. Epilogue. What the water knows. 18 months after the divorce, Nora and I got married again. Not in a church. Not with 200 people. Not with the elaborate orchestration of 2 people performing a life for an audience. We drove to the county clerk's office on a Wednesday afternoon, her day off my half day, and signed the paperwork and walked out onto Harbor Street in the October sun and stood there for a moment feeling the weight and the lightness of it. "That was very practical," Nora said. "We're practical people." She laughed. And it was the laugh I'd heard from the bottom of the stairs, unguarded. Natural, the laugh of someone who had forgotten, at least for this moment, that the rest of the world existed. We walked to the fish market and bought salmon for dinner. We drove to my house, our house again, the Victorian on Cliffside Road, with her tile and her fixture and her garden that had kept growing despite everything. And I made dinner while she had at the kitchen table and read. Eleanor came over at 7 with a bottle of wine she'd been saving. She said for exactly this. "For what?" I asked. "For when you two stopped being idiots," she said. After Eleanor left, we sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the harbor. The boats creaking against the dock, the occasional horn of a late vessel, the rhythm of the water against the seawall patient, and constant the same sound that had been here before us and would be here after. "Do you think it's different this time?" Nora asked. "Or just the same thing trying again?" I thought about it. "Different. We're different people. I'm not sure I'm better." "Neither am I," I said. "But I think we're more honest. And I think that's the part that matters." She leaned her head against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. The harbor lights were doing what they do in October, arranging themselves into something that looked from the right angle, like a map of all the distances you've traveled to arrive at this exact place. 26 years of the same woman. And here we were starting again with everything we now knew, which was more than we'd known before and less than we'd need, and exactly enough to begin. "The ocean doesn't lie," And neither in the end did we. The end. Cast of characters. Caleb Marsh, owner and founder of Marsh Marine and Fabrication, Crestport, Oregon. 47. 23 years of building his business from nothing. Naval background, harbor town roots. A man who expresses himself through work and loves through presence, and learned too late. And then just in time, that presence requires more than being in the room. Nora Elliott Marsh, Senior Development Planner, Crestport County Planning Department. 44. 11 years building a career from expertise and discipline. At 18, she held her family together through her father's psychiatric crisis. Never fully separated that obligation from the rest of her relationships. Made a terrible choice and lived with the full weight of its consequences. Marcus Elliott, Nora's younger brother. 34. CEO of Elliott, Meridian Developments, Crestport. A man who has spent 20 years using his sister's guilt as a lever. Not a monster, something more ordinary and more damaging, a person who mistakes possession for love and has never been required to know the difference. Pete Wharton, shop foreman, Marsh Marine. 20 years in Caleb's employ. The kind of friend whose value is only fully understood in a crisis. Never wastes words. Always knows the difference between a problem that needs talking through and a problem that needs solving. Donna Reyes, family law attorney, Harbor Street, Crestport. 53. The best family law attorney between Crestport and Portland, and the kind of professional who serves her clients' actual interests rather than the interests they think they have. Eleanor Elliott, Nora's mother. 71. Crestport, 40 years. The person who understood the full picture longest and said the least, and who knew exactly when to say something and what to say. Made coffee and dinner and quiet room for the people she loved. And those are not small things. Thematic elements. Betrayal. Nora's 14-month affair. The hidden brother. The diverted money. The compromised variance. Affair, Marcus and Nora, built on old guilt and old dependency mistaken for love. Family fracture. The Elliott family history. The father's illness. The girl who became the adult. The brother who never released his hold. Sacrifice, Caleb's 23 years of building Nora's 18-year-old self, holding a collapsing household. Eleanor's years of silent understanding. Third-party manipulation. Marcus as the destabilizing presence, not merely a lover, but a deliberate architect of separation. Contested assets. The business. The house, the savings, the ethics. Review every dimension of a shared life becoming contested territory. Reconciliation. Not easy, not clean, not quick. A slow reconstruction over 18 months that required both people to become different versions of themselves. Healing found in work, in honest conversation, in Eleanor's kitchen, in the long patience of the harbor.